G'day, my name is Nick, and in today's diorama, I really wanted to try and push my storytelling skills and create a really interesting world that really feels like it's lived in. The story I came up with is a samurai who returns home to his village in flames. He discovers that the Spider Queen has attacked his people, and filled with rage, he vows to seek revenge. Getting started on the Spider Queen, I'll first superglue all the legs of her abdomen onto the 3D printed body. I would usually print a piece like this all in one part, but it was just a bit too large to fit into my printer. With the spider body all glued, filled and sanded, I can move on to base coating it. I'll start with just a black primer, and then use some silly putty to mask off little sections on the legs. This will then let me create some red highlights on the legs. With the tips of the legs all done, I can then remove the silly putty and move on to creating the highlights across the rest of the body. I'll then grab my wet palette and start to paint in some of the intricate details across the body of the 3D printed spider. The Spider Queen's abdomen has this really cool arcane looking detail running up its back. I'll fill these sections in with some black paint to create a contrast against the red and orange highlights we added earlier. With the body of the Spider Queen all done, we can move on to the upper human section. I'll once again use some silly putty to mask off just the skin of her body. I can then come in with some red flesh tones, and then coming over the top with some more progressively bronze and pale, skinny flesh tones. Once that's all done, I'll then mask off the areas of skin we just painted and move on to her red dress. As you can see, there's a few little sections that I missed with the red paint, but I can go in there and just clean up those details in the next step. Grabbing my paintbrush out again, I'll start to paint in some of the finer details across the body of her. I was initially going to paint her eyeballs in like a normal human, but I thought it'd be cool to actually just paint the eyes fully black to really give her that sort of, spidery, creepy look. After I've glued on her little umbrella with some super glue, she is pretty much done. I can then attach her body to the lower spidery section. I could have turned out pretty creepy. I definitely wouldn't want to meet her alone in some Japanese forest. With the Spider Queen all done now, I can move on to starting the Shinto temple. To get started on the temple, I'll first grab these little 3D printed rails and super glue them onto the outside of a base that I created for the temple. The base is really just a thin piece of plywood hot glued onto a section of XPF foam that is about the same height as the handrails. The foam is really just there to support the weight of the temple, which will go on top. As you can see, the railings definitely can't handle much force on top of them. The 3D printed rails definitely would be strong enough to hold the weight of the temple and the spider, which will go on top, so that foam is just there for support. I'll then give the base and the walls of the temple a coat of paint. I masked off some of the support sections on the walls so I could more easily go in and airbrush white into the flat panels of the walls. I'll then remove the masking tape and start adding some grime and dirt and weathering to the temple. To achieve this, I'll grab some oil washes and start to carefully dab and paint on some built up dirt and moss and fungus that you'd expect to grow in an abandoned temple. To make it look like there's some black mold spots growing on the temple, I'll add some wash to a paintbrush and then flick the paint across the wall surfaces to create a really random and organic appearance to the mold. I'll then repeat these steps on the lower wooden sections of the temple. And with that, I can hot glue both sections of the temple together. I'll move on to the roof section a bit later on in the build. I'll now start work on the actual base for the diorama. The first steps in creating the base are really just going to be to hot glue some XPF foam down onto a piece of plywood that I cut out to the approximate shape. I want to have a little lake section at the front of the diorama, so I'll take a hobby knife and start carving into the foam. To remove larger sections, I've got this little vape that I turned into a hot wire cutter, which I'll use to remove larger chunks of foam. Once the foam is carved into a rocky shape that I'm happy with, I'll grab some terrain paste that I made with some plaster of Paris, some rocks, and some paint all mixed together. I'll then apply this to the bottom of the lake and then add a layer of it across the top of the diorama to create the rocky ground. I'll then apply some green and brown and black washes just to create a bit more variation in the textures and colors across the diorama. Next, I'll apply some vegetation to the lake section using some flock and a few stabilized plants that I purchased online. I'll attach these plants to the base using some UV cure resin. I'll actually be finding and stabilizing some plants of my own later in the build, so stick around if you want to see how you can turn real plants you find in your local area into materials that you can add into your own dioramas. I'll now jump back onto the roof section as I was waiting for it to print out from my 3D printer. It was way too big to print in one part, so I had to break it up into a few different sections and then glue it back together now with some super glue. I'll start the paint job by coating the whole thing in this sort of dark green. I can then grab a lighter green on a dry brush and then catch all the highlights and raised sections of the roof. This will just create a bit more contrast to the paint job and sort of look like those sections are a bit more weathered. Many Shinto shrines will feature these beautiful gold sections across their structures, so I really wanted to capture these features in my own temple design. Now, just like the previous sections of the building, I'll add some oil washes across the roof just to make it look a little bit more weathered. And with that, I can now hot glue down the shrine onto the base. I'll keep the roof separate for now, as it really doesn't need to be glued down and will just help if I need to transport the diorama in future. Now I've got the base layer of rock and gravel down the diorama, I'll move on to getting some vegetation on there with some static grass. I recently purchased a new static grass applicator and I think it's going to be great for this situation. I'll get the box set up by just plugging in the cables and then filling up a little container with some 6mm static grass. I'll then apply some scenic glue in little patches across the areas where I want the grass to sit. I'm going to leave a little gap in the middle so it sort of looks like a path leading up towards the temple. With the glue all spread out, I'll then start applying some grass over the top. The device charges the little particles of grass with static electricity so they stick up in the air when they land in the glue. This just creates a bit more of a realistic looking grass rather than just letting gravity take the fibers. I'll now continue on with the rest of the base. To build up a few more layers of moss and greenery, I'll spray down some watered down PVA and then apply down some flock just to create some varying textures and colours. While I have the static grass applicator out, I thought it'd be cool to add some little grassy tufts to the roof to sort of look like nature is reclaiming this temple. I found these cool little spider statues online and printed them out. I think they're from like a Far Cry game or something, but I think they really suited the story of the diorama and sort of made it feel like it's a Sekiro game or something, like where Sekiro has to fight some spider demon boss. I built up weathered layers on the spider statue with a few different coats of greens and greys. I'll then give the whole little spider a coat and oil wash just to bring out the details. Lastly, I'll coat the whole spider totem in some spray adhesive and then sprinkle on some green flock vegetation, letting it fall into all the cracks and crevices. I can then hot glue these statues onto the diorama. I can now really start building up the layers of overgrown vegetation. I'll start with some moss that I collected out in my yard, which I preserved and painted. I'll just secure that down to the base using some simple PVA glue. I found that using real plants is definitely the best way to get a realistic look. Although with that all said, I'm jumping back and I printed out some gnarled trees which will sit on either side of the temple. I'll just secure them down using some hot glue. Now, don't tell my neighbor, but I spotted some really cool moss growing out the front of their house that I just might have gone and pinched a little bit of, so yeah. To preserve the moss, I will create a batch of glycerin, water, and green fabric dye. Mixing these all together, I can then add the plants into. After a couple of days, the glycerin will soak into the fibers and replace all the water within them, essentially preserving the plants and stopping them from rotting. After a few days of sitting in the preserving fluid, I pulled them out and then gave them a bit of an airbrush with some green paints. And this is what they turned out like. These plants should now last for years on the diorama. I'll then stick them down with just some PVA glue. Since it would look a little bit boring with just one kind of preserved plant, I grabbed my assortment of other plants, which I purchased from a shop on Etsy. I'll link them down below, but as you can see, it's pretty easy to preserve your own plants, so I definitely recommend trying it if you have any thoughts of doing it. I'll now just continue to build up the leafy vegetation across the diorama to create a really overgrown look to this temple. I'll seal it all down with some watered down PVA glue. Next, the dead trees were looking a little bit bare, so to add a bit of greenery to them, I grabbed this vine flock material, and after coating the trees in some glue, I can then wrap the vines around the branches to make it look like they're hanging down like some lichen. Shinto shrines usually have these cool little lanterns leading up to their entrances, so I definitely wanted to add these to my diorama as well. Just like the actual shrine, I painted them and weathered them using some oil washes. I can then attach them onto the diorama. Now, to really get some depth in the variety of the plants across the build, I've got these little laser cut ferns. To prepare these, I just pulled them out from their paper base and then folded them into the shape that a fern would naturally sit in nature. Once they're all folded and rolled into shape, I'll attach them to the ground with a bit of super glue. To add a bit more to the story elements of this build, I printed out some people that have been captured and cocooned in spider's web. I fastened these to the base using some toothpicks that I glued into them. To enhance the creepy atmosphere of the build, I wanted to add in some spider's eggs throughout the scene. I made these by rolling up small balls of oven-baked Sculpey clay. After baking, I attached a few toothpicks to some of the eggs for a strong hold in the base. I then glued the remaining eggs onto these anchored ones. This creates, some really disturbing clusters of eggs, just emphasizing the dangerous environment that this place is. Now, to really sell the effect that this is a spider-infested area, I used Green Stuff World spider serum in my airbrush. A few drops of this sprays out in wispy strands that look just like fine spider's webs. This effect really sells the idea of these bodies being covered in webs and clusters of spider eggs. I reckon it definitely enhances the eerie atmosphere of the scene. We obviously can't have a spider temple without a whole bunch of little spiders, or I guess big spiders really, living in the area as well. I printed out a bunch of these little creepy spiders and painted them up. Next, I'm going to create a little pier that juts down into the water for the samurai to stand on. I'll cut up a few boards from some balsa wood and then glue these to a little base. I'll attach some legs onto it, and lastly just get a bit of paint and some moss onto it. I can then secure the pier onto the diorama. I kind of wanted to have some aquatic spiders inside the actual water, sort of creeping up and ambushing the samurai, so I secured them down with a bit of hot glue. To create the water of the lake, I'm going to be using Les Resin's deep pour epoxy resin. This stuff is great for pouring water up to 4 inches thick. Les Resin pretty much has every kind of resin or UV cure resin that you could need for any of your projects, so check out their Amazon store link in my description. I'll add some green and blue dye and then chuck the whole thing into my vacuum chamber to suck out all the air bubbles that I introduced while stirring the mixture. Now, because this is going to be quite a thick pour, I didn't want to risk it, so I threw the whole project in my chest freezer. I can then pour the resin into the mold directly in the freezer. When resin cures, actually is an exothermic reaction, so if it's too deep and gets too hot, it can actually boil and crack, which would completely ruin the whole project. So I definitely want it to be rather safe than sorry, but it does take a lot longer to cure, which, I think is worth it, to be honest. With the resin water all cured and cleaned up, I can move on to adding the spiders into the diorama. Some of them I secured down with some toothpicks, and others I just placed around in certain areas. Next, I'll move on to creating the actual samurai hero of this story. I'll paint him up using a combination of airbrushing, just normal painting, dry brushing, and then finally adding a wash on the top of his whole body to blend in all the different panels of him. Once the painting was all done, I can then attach his body to his legs and then slide his head into the neck slot. Finally, just adding his awesome katana to the hilt of his blade. The blade was a little bit straight off the printer, so I grabbed my hot air gun, which is actually just a hair straightener to be honest, and bent that little blade. Because it's plastic, it just will heat up and will sort of stick in the spot that I bent it. I was having a bit of a think about the story of this diorama, and I thought it could be really interesting for the samurai to have a bit more of a reason to attack the spider demon. I thought it would be cool to maybe have it that the spider demon stole his wife when she attacked the village, and now he's on a quest to save her. Luckily, I found just the perfect model to represent the samurai's wife. It's this female character that's all bound up in spiders' webs and even has a little few spiders crawling across her body. I'll paint her up very similar to how I painted all the previous models. I'll place the wife right in the heart of the temple where the samurai will have to fight through hordes of spiders and the spider queen to get her home safe. Lastly, just to make her blend in a little bit more with the diorama, I sprayed a bit more of that spider serum. I can now finally assemble the full diorama, adding in the roof of the temple, placing the giant spider demon queen, and the samurai who's valiantly facing her. Thanks so much for sticking around all the way to the end of my video. I really tried to push my creativity and storytelling in this build, and I think it turned out pretty good. If you guys have any other interesting ideas for creatures or something else creepy or interesting that I could make a diorama from, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, check out the reveal.